Good evening, everyone, to people in the room as well as to everyone online. My name is Melanie Tandinian and I'm the current director of the Center for Armenian Studies. Thank you all for being here. I know it's a busy moment at the end of the semester and it's hard to carve out time. And before we begin, I would like to thank our program specialist, Naira Tuman, for all of her hard work. And also take this opportunity to wish her all the best in her future endeavors, as this unfortunately is Naira's last evening with us, and she's going to move on to a fabulous new position that very much speaks to her accomplishments. And we really miss her here, as she's been the heart of the center for many years. As this is a hybrid event, so hi Zoomers. I also welcome you, of course, for joining us, and also would like to encourage you to place all of your beautiful questions into the Q&A section at the very bottom of your screen. After 2 years of Zooming, I think we all know how that goes. It is April, and we are nearing the April 24th, which for Armenians around the globe marks the beginning of the genocide perpetrated against their ancestors by the Ottoman Imperial government in 1915. The legacy of the genocide from 107 years ago, its memory, and what scholars increasingly have called its afterlife, is not only an important part of Armenian identity, as we all know, but also has grown despite continuous Turkish state-sponsored denial and contestation into a significant field of scholarly inquiry over the last 4 decades. Today's speaker, Dr. Michelle Tusan, has long been a contributor to this field, and her talk tonight will speak to one of her newest projects, namely the digital mapping of the refugee crisis as it resulted in the aftermath of the genocide, when she renders visible a fluid human geography in the context or in sort of aftermath of total war. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Tusan to Michigan in person. We have met online on multiple occasions. We share the same alma mater. And it's been years that we've been talking and emailing, but this is the first time that we actually meet in person after all those years. And it's such a great treat to have you here. Michelle Tusan is a professor of history. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 1999. And upon graduating, she joined Stanford University as a fellow of the humanities before moving to the University of Nevada in Las Vegas in 2001. And in addition to her institutional appointment, she also currently serves as the vice president of the studies. A British historian by training, her teaching and scholarship broadly engages relationships between geopolitics, culture, and human rights. And her current book project, The Last Treaty, The Middle Eastern Front and the End of the First World War, is supported by the National Endowment, I was going to say Near East Foundation, as that comes to mind when we think of humanitarianism in the Ottoman Empire. But no, it is supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And you can already get a glimpse at this new work by reading her article published by the online Lausanne project, which is a super cool digital project online. And there's an article of hers that's titled The Woman of No Importance, which speaks really to the anxiety, apathy, and confusion that accompanied the Lausanne negotiations. Dr. Tusan is a prolific scholar who has authored 3 monographs and a textbook, and her first book, Women Making News, Gender and Journalism in Modern Britain, was published in 2005 by Illinois University Press. And after that, she turned her gaze towards British international and imperial politics and humanitarianism with a special focus on the Ottoman Empire and the Armenian Genocide. Her second award-winning monograph, Smyrna's Ashes, Humanitarianism, Genocide, and the Birth of the Middle East, was published in 2012 by the University of California Press. And her most recent book, The British Empire and the Armenian Genocide, Humanitarianism and Imperial Politics from Gladstone to Churchill, came out in 2017. Her list of peer-reviewed articles is way too long to recite here, but among their places of publication are the most coveted journals of history, as you might know, the American Historical Review, the Journal of Modern History, and Past and Present. Tusan's work is foundational when it comes to thinking about late 19th and early 20th century international human affairs. In her work, Tusan persuasively argues for the coupling of humanitarianism and foreign policy in late Victorian Britain. Smyrna's Ashes, for instance, carefully traces the development of private philanthropic and humanitarian intervention on behalf of Ottoman Armenians, placing the humanitarian activities and debates surrounding them into the context of British domestic politics, liberal power, and the larger context of the infamous Eastern question that preoccupied Western powers in the late 19th and early 20th century. The British Empire and the Armenian Genocide is a history of the first attempt to not only intervene on behalf of genocide victims, but also to prosecute those responsible. In this work, Tusan highlights the British indictment of the Ottoman Empire for what by then the international community was calling crimes against humanity. This indictment, Tusan argues, gave intervention into the internal affairs of a sovereign state on humanitarian grounds, both a moral and legal cause, even if in the end the prosecution of Ottoman officials largely failed. Despite the failure of the Ottoman war crimes tribunals due to slow-paced peace settlements, dwindling military presence in the region, and unresolved questions of what international jurisdiction should actually look like, the tribunals and the indictment, Tusan argues, left an important legacy, and in her words, remain a guiding principle in modern attempts to stop genocide and prosecute war crimes. This evening, however, Dr. Tusan is stepping away from imperial or international politics of intervention to introduce us to a digital project that she's been working on for some time now. And she has been rendering data from official documents, memoirs, institutional records, diaries of survivors, aid workers, and also other non-combatants who were present in the Middle East into visual representation. And what we will see is sort of, it's called deep maps. And these deep maps reveal how refugee routes and war relief infrastructure reconfigured an entire landscape. The refugee experience in this context of those fleeing the genocide took form, as Dr. Tusan will illustrate this evening, in the desert, the camps, and on the road during a protracted and seemingly unending war, which of course had important consequences for minorities in the larger post-war Middle East. And I think, and I hope, that this project will become, and may inspire and also become perhaps the blueprint for recording experiences of other communities displaced by war and genocide. It's a really fantastic project that we will now be privy to partake in. And so I would like to welcome you up here, take over from me, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Try this mic. I hope this works. Yeah. Do we need to move a little bit closer? How does that work? It doesn't matter for you because you're here. But for those online, I'm going to go analog here, even though my maps are digital. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a real privilege and honor to be here, especially for the April 24th commemoration. Today, I will be talking about refugees and genocide, and thank you, Melody, for that complete introduction. My research maps the Armenian genocide refugee crisis in order to render visible the human geography of total war. Today, I'll be showing you a series of deep maps, as Melanie said, rendered using ARC GIS technology to reveal how refugee routes and war relief infrastructure reconfigured the landscape during World War I in the Middle East. The experience of those fleeing genocide took form in the desert, in the camp, and on the road. The Armenian genocide, I argue, left an indelible mark on the course of World War I and determined how it ended. The Armenian genocide belongs at the center of the study of the human cost of total war. This requires reassessing the chronology of World War I itself. Though 1918 marked the end of fighting in Western Europe, war continued for another 5 years in the East until the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. This makes the end of World War I seem less than certain. Can we consider the Armenian genocide in the same way? When it ended is more than a chronological question, just as it is for World War I. Genocide as lived experience continues well into the 1920s and 1930s, as most clearly manifested in the refugee crisis and resettlement schemes started by the Allies and humanitarian organizations. The plight of refugees falls outside of traditional definitional boundaries of the Armenian genocide, but it does remain part of the shared experience of war and genocide, not only for Armenians, Syrians, and Greeks, the victims, but for those who attempted to mitigate its effects: humanitarian aid workers, international institutions, and individual actors, as well as for those populations who had to deal with the massive disruption of refugees. These included the Arabs, who faced disruptive effects of mass migration to the Middle East, and the Russians in the Caucasus. I came to this project as a European historian, looking to explain why so little work has been done on the Middle East during World War I. World War I studies still focus on the war with Germany and the Western Front. Most histories start with the Guns of August in 1914 and end with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. My current book project expands this chronology to make room for what I'm calling the Middle Eastern Front. Here, civilians emerged as central to both war making and diplomacy. In short, they became new weapons of war, threatened by their own government and defended by the Allied invaders. The protracted negotiations leading up to the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne, which ultimately ended World War I in 1923, hinged on the minority question and the pragmatic politics of empire. Reading World War I in this way puts the Armenian genocide and the refugee crisis at the heart of the conflict between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire. The interactive digital maps that I'm going to show you today are compiled from around 50 memoirs and diaries written by deportees, aid workers, and eyewitnesses who traveled the deportation routes between 1915 and 1930. Patterns in my data suggest that the experience of total war determined Allied strategies and humanitarian practice during World War I. They also shaped the future norms and conditions for dealing with displaced people that will have legacies after the war, after World War II as well. My narrative starts where most narratives of the Armenian genocide do, with the arrest of around 200 intellectuals and community leaders in Constantinople on April 24, 1915, on the eve of the Allied invasion of Gallipoli. It was then where many of the journeys of those Christian minorities marked for elimination by the Ottoman government began. Between 1915 and 1917, the deportation routes were flooded with internal refugees. The successful Allied invasion of Baghdad in the spring of 1917 created a strange situation, and it's here where my story takes shape. Massacres continued. At the same time, a network of humanitarian organizations funded by international aid agencies and Allied governments worked to undo the Ottoman government's efforts. Aid stations grew up along the deportation routes in an attempt to help refugees and eventually get them home. What we would today call NGOs had operated in the Ottoman Empire since the late 19th century. These wartime institutions, however, were different due to their size, their scale, and their purpose, which was to provide aid to a population targeted for elimination in wartime. Internal refugees, the focus of my study, survived in large part due to the humanitarian assistance and the Allied war machine. Together, they supported refugee camps and auxiliary aid stations, which included soup kitchens, clothing distribution sites, hospitals, and orphanages. Through mapping these institutions and experiences of exile over time and space, this part of the book project charts a particular story of displacement and survival. It also sheds light on why survivors often endured the problem of statelessness that created scattered diaspora communities in the post-Ottoman Middle East. So now, let's see if I can get my maps to work. Okay, thank you. This chart is a breakdown of the maps I'll show you today of single women, single men, those arrested on April 24th, eyewitnesses, aid workers, and deportees. It includes the range of points plotted, locations, and distances depicted on the maps. And these points plotted the number of stories you can see here in each of these categories. I had a wonderful map maker who took my data and put them in these ARC GIS ones. I did not do that part of the project, but this is her breakdown of the distances and plots pointed. Now, I do not claim my sample is definitive in any way, and because of the nature of my sources, memoirs, diaries, and archives, this mapping should be considered representational rather than an exact description of movements. I'm a cultural historian. I'm looking for patterns, and those patterns give me some meaningful data. People experience genocide as perpetrators, victims, and/or observers. Much scholarship has focused on the anatomy of the Armenian Genocide, what happened and who was to blame, in order to inscribe the Armenian Genocide into history. The success of this approach, pioneered by some in this audience, has made it possible to do a study like this one. I thank you for this important work. Otherwise, I couldn't have done this bit. Here, I seek to understand the Armenian Genocide as a shared historical experience that encompasses diverse peoples and ecologies. This approach helps answer, I think, what is a new kind of question, which is, what really happens in the physical spaces of exile when one people attempts to erase all traces of the other? First, a bit about my methodology. My purpose in the larger project is to make visible the experience of deportees in Ottoman concentration camps and later Allied supported refugee camps. What I've published so far narrates the relationship between camps, humanitarian actors, and the Allies during World War I using rather traditional historical methodologies. I came to this part of the project as a digital humanities skeptic. I didn't trust the promises that big data will reveal new quantitative truths, but I needed a new method to access that difficult to pin down category of experience. I wondered what humanist geographers call deep maps could reveal about how people experience genocide that the traditional methodologies I've been trained in could not. So I learned three things. First, quantitative data allows me to ask qualitative questions about the effectiveness of genocide's attempt to erase an entire people. It also helps account for some of the silences in the archive. Second, deep maps show the presence of deportees over the long term and the experience of exile that existed within the Ottoman Empire. Environmental conditions of the desert of the desert deportation routes matter, as does the length of time people spent as internal refugees in these spaces. Finally, and I think most importantly, these maps put real people into the story. We know where and how genocide happened. Now we need to know who it happened to. Excellent work has been done to show the architecture and reveal the architects of the Armenian Genocide to counter denialist narratives. It's time to show the intersection between data and human stories. I want to understand how deportees move through time and space and why they survived. And I hope this has some implications for that question of internal refugeedom more broadly. So how, when, and where survivors move matters. In its most ambitious articulation, I believe that this kind of mapping provides the missing link between the experience and act of genocide. It requires, though, building an archive, using digital maps and representational strategies that put survivors, who I'm going to talk about today, and some of whom are pictured on this slide. These are some of the stories of the memoirs I use. These are the folks. And it puts them at the center of the story. And that is my goal, is to put people at the center. And if I had a dream for this project, it would be to expand the sample to as many diverse stories and experiences, crowdsourcing and bleeding of archives to just really figure out, see how many we could map. But for now, we're starting with my relatively small, modest sample. My research started with locating the places where humanitarian assistance took place. I then gathered the memoirs of those who used this aid and looked for patterns to show how genocide manifests itself. This first map, I promise I do have maps. Oh, there it is. This first map plots the string of refugee camps and auxiliary institutions that aided survivors. Many were set up in the wake of the 1917 Baghdad invasion and the subsequent Allied occupation of the Ottoman Empire. I'd like to compare this traditional map with its interactive version. This first map is from my recently published JMH article and shows humanitarian aid locations in the Ottoman Empire after Baghdad. This map is a still representation from an interactive map that I did with the help of my friend, my ARC GIS geographer. And I've included this particular map because just to show that it fits well within the traditional format of a journal article, complete with a descriptive caption. But as you can see, refugee movement and refugees themselves are absent. It's a pretty traditional rendering of places and spaces. It plots the clinics, clothing distribution centers, food relief hospitals, and industrial work sites, orphanages, refugee camps, and rescue homes. And here, I'll just blow that up a little bit. So that's the bigger map. In the article, I use it to illustrate my point about the prevalence of aid networks in the Ottoman Empire during the latter half of the war. But a map like this one I would consider a first step towards illustrating the deportees' relationship to genocidal policy, aid work, and the realities of the wartime emergency. You can plot it in space, right? We see it on the physical geography. When we know where the institutions of aid exist, we can then add the stories of deportees to learn how survival works. So I feel like this is my first layer of my first map layer. Though this one layer on its own is nevertheless really limited as one layer, as a one-dimensional representation. Now, what I'd like to do now is show you how this information looks on the interactive map from which it was drawn. So this was a still that I drew from this map. Somewhere else. So the same data that went into making that map with the addition, I'll show you what I'm doing, because this is big, this is good, this is as big as it'll go. Okay, so this is the ArcGIS rendering of the data, of some of the data that I had on that first layer. I think that it's a more complex tool, more than simply depicting things. It actually has become a research tool for me. Though it does not lend itself to easy publication. This only exists in website form at the moment. And I've really just been using it as a tool. So I think this raises questions about traditional publishing and how one actually conveys these kinds of this kind of data to a larger audience and reception-wise. But this interactive map allows me to layer data to show how refugees and aid workers interacted in these spaces. And we can adjust them using topographical representation. So what I'd like to do is sorry. So I'm showing you my data here. So we can use a base map gallery, which is pretty cool. So I've been using the topographical one. I think, let's use this one here. So now you can see the desert really. There is a number of other tools that other different kinds of maps, but I think this one might show up the best where you can actually get a little more in detail. But that's a new layer in of itself that you can see where these stations are and why they sort of exist in the space where they do. They don't exist right here, right? There are topographical reasons. So that just doing that allows you to layer the data to figure out the topographical representation. Let's do some stuff with these representations. So this here, just so we know what. Sorry. Oh, maybe it's not. Okay, well, we've got the camps layered on top of refugee camps. Refugee camps and auxiliary aid stations are layered on top of each other. So let's just do one of these. So let's just layer Ottoman concentration camps on top of refugee camps. Let's get rid of everything else. Let's turn it on. So we kind of cleared away some of the auxiliary aid institutions, and we're just looking at where the refugee camps are and where the Ottoman concentration camps are, where people were deported. And when I did this the first time, what I realized is that many of these are layered on top of each other. The refugee camps are in the same places as the Ottoman, the concentration camps. And this just allows you to ask some different kinds of questions. We also know that refugees often follow these routes in reverse to get home. So it allows us to figure out why and how people could do that. If you were stuck in the South, deported in the South, if you were a survivor, how you were able to work your way back up through these things. So it does allow us to sort of map these two sides. These routes were moved, they moved down, and then people moved back up quite easily. I think the ability to layer this map just in this one way allows us to ask questions about how aid actually worked. So are the refugees following aid, or is aid following the refugees? Right? We don't know that, right? But we can if we trace when and where these happened. You can also plot the points between these maps. You find an address or place, you can use a tool that plots how far it is, and that's pretty useful to figure out how far someone would travel to get to an orphanage, how far they would travel to get to floating aid distribution. Would people just set up shop and stay in one place because that was easier? But it does ask that question, how far do these refugee camps and these institutions have to be spaced from one another? So being able to calculate distance is a useful way to answer some of those questions. I think maps like this really help our understanding of these spaces, physical spaces of exile. Ron Suni's book, They Can Live in the Desert But No Place Else, explicitly in the title ties the no man's land of the deportation experience to the project of genocide. Samuel Dolby's environmental history of the Armenian Genocide takes this further, arguing that sending Armenians into the desert was a, quote, weapon and means of deniability for the Ottoman state. The southern Ottoman lands where these deportation routes led, and you can see on this map here, emerges both a space of suffering and survival, according to Dolby. I think these spaces matter particularly in the context of total war because these routes, remember, are being traveled during wartime. Most of them, at least until 1921, there's active military, and even you could say up to 23, there's active military activity in these regions. So I think that really matters. If we focus on the locations of aid, this map reveals the imprint of the Allied military and humanitarian aid institutions on the Ottoman landscape during the war, which I think is also important. The humanitarian and military aspects of the war, as I've argued elsewhere, were linked after 1917, when the British occupation dominated the southern lands of the Ottoman Empire. The British Empire thus put pressure on the Ottomans by occupying their empire in a very particular kind of way. It was not just a military occupation, but a humanitarian one as well. And it was one where the military and humanitarian aid organizations replaced concentration camps with aid sites. I think it's worth mentioning that the repurposing of the deportation camp as refugee camp has the potential to erase the sites of genocidal violence. Deportation camps where people died by the hundreds of thousands became, in some cases, sites of aid distribution under the British occupation. The crimes that happen here do not leave physical traces in the same way as they would have if there were structures that remained as part of the landscape on these sites. The tents and the caravan tracks eventually disappeared, erasing the evidence of genocide on the land. Only the mass graves remained, to be explained away by genocide denialists as just another result of war. Mapping Allied humanitarian aid infrastructure also can be used to tell a more human story of internal refugee movement. I think including the refugee experience is important to understand the consequences at the end of empire in a wartime context. We know from memoirs that journeys home followed the deportation routes in reverse and also often took years. I've been charting the experience of mostly Armenian, but also Greek and Syrian survivors of the genocide who occupied these spaces in varying degrees. Again, another useful way we could do this is use the distance tab to layer a map like this that follows people getting home on these maps. And what I'd eventually like to do is move my sample onto these and have actual physical people in these, representations, and then to be able to chart them. That's sort of a next a next step. We're sort of working that way. So I'm going to show you some static maps that will help you see how this is going to work. I think the ability to layer refugees' journeys on this map, adding one more layer to calculate distances, allows us to ask questions like, how does the existence of aid networks and internal refugees remake these landscapes? How does their physical presence matter in this period? We're not just talking 1915 to 17, we're talking sometimes 1915 to 1930 and beyond. Well, really 1930. So let's turn to the experience of deportation itself. We know that there were different routes which followed a general pattern. Let me go back. I'm always nervous relying on an internet map. Okay. So let's turn to the experience of deportation itself. We know there were different routes which followed a general pattern. Deportation maps like this one show where genocide happened. And in this work, I relied heavily on Raymond Kevorkian's work to put this map together. I think the Armenians, what we should see here is how the Armenians deported from the high plateau regions of Anatolia, labeled as Route 1 on this map, were massacred largely between June and July of 1915 and didn't reach Syria generally. So that's Route 1, kind of in the gray with black. Those who crossed the Taurus Mountains and entered the Arab provinces to the south took two different routes labeled as 2 and 3 on this map. The first in red was through northern Mesopotamia, stretching from the Euphrates River to the Tigris River. Most of those who took this route were massacred in the cities indicated, as we can see. Try to use my pointer, but the ones in red. So they didn't make it. And then that was about 1916. The other route, this yellow route, corresponded to the inland regions and resulted in more survivors, largely in Cilicia, who for political and other reasons I won't go into here, were eventually resettled. This region ran parallel to the Mediterranean, as you can see, and extended southward from Aleppo to the boundaries of the Sinai Peninsula. So I think it's important that we know these routes to sort of figure out who, like, what was followed. Not everyone was on these deportation routes, but there were just specific groups and specific people who were there. I want to show you a chaotic map. So forgive me for the chaos of this map. There's a purpose for representing it this way. These are my travelers. These are my deportees, and it's every point that everyone I mapped followed. So every dot represents a move by one of my 34 deportees, and I'm representing it this way to show the chaotic scale of movement. Remember that these deportees themselves were part of massive caravans which occupied this space long after the genocide began in 1915. This map reveals the deportation route as a space of contact. Victims came into regular contact with communities that we've assumed largely have been passive observers. Oh, it happened outside of town, no one saw them. My focus on survivor journeys concentrates attention on the moments of contact, the distance and places traveled rather than the destination itself. I want to draw attention to the connections between these many blue, I don't know if they look blue to you, but they're all supposed to be a different shade of blue. But I think that it's important to see that survivors are everywhere on these routes and they remain visible. This is just my 34 people, right? What if you really calculated the numbers of these caravans interacting in these spaces? I think this is why erasure is so essential to the genocidal project. It happens on these routes where orphanages and Muslim households absorb and convert survivors. I'd argue that the project of genocide is only complete when Christian minority refugees were denied the right of return and expelled in 1930 by the Turkish state. This map of hundreds of blue dots renders the caravans and individuals in the caravans visible as they would have been at the time, but differently represented. Many became internal refugees and had to pass, convert, or risk deportation or death. As my previous map showed, your route determined your chances of survival. But as this map illustrates, survivors remained present in Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the southern Ottoman provinces for years. What does this tell us about the experience of genocide? I argue that the caravans of human wrecks, as Vahe Tashchin called them, and represented by these dots, made genocide visible and impossible to ignore. Caravans were part of the geography of the Ottoman Empire, starting in 1915, and survivors traveled these routes throughout the 1920s. Camps on the outskirts of town held thousands of people at a time. Caravans came through the towns and villages, and even when they were not allowed into the city, deportees found a way to move in and out of these spaces, to buy bread, communicate with loved ones, and sometimes to hide. This next interactive map, this is not an ARC GIS map, but I hope it's interesting to you because it's my way that I'm trying to, this is my bridge to putting the next layer on. But I just wanted to render visible my my stories. And I know this, I have to find a better way to represent them because they look like spots on this map. But what I did is I just wanted to locate where everyone started. And I have a short biography of everyone that I've mapped here. And it tells their stories, but you just get to know where they started. So this is just the beginning points. So you can see the diversity of where individuals who survived came from. It wasn't just those single routes. The diversity of survival, I guess, is one point of looking at this. I think that when we separate these out, we can see many people were in Istanbul, of course, who started here in their journeys. But I think it also, as a web-based resource, allows people to connect with not just blue dots, but these are real people who had real stories and lives, and lots of this was taken from the memoirs. This map, I think is kind of amazing. It shows the starting and end point of everyone's journey. It doesn't show the individual dots, otherwise it just wouldn't have worked. You saw my blue dots, right? But one of the neat things about it is like you can, okay, so you see, all right, see this, you can follow them. You can see where they went. And you can see the arc of their journeys. And if we go out, you can see their eventual locations. And what I think is interesting is that we often tell the story of America and Europe, but what we see is we see a lot of people ended up internally in what we would call what becomes the Middle East. And so I think that we have to really rethink when we talk about diaspora communities. We have to understand that diaspora communities mean these folks here too. I'm going to show you them on here. So this map, I asked my map maker, I said, this has got to be a mistake. There's no arc. He said, no, that was the one person who ended up in the place where he began. One person ended up home. Which is remarkable, right? Like that's like a great outlier that you're like, I'm like, no, you did that wrong. She's like, no, he ended where he went. He went all the way through here, and then he ended up back in the same place. So these are just some things that we can do with it. And I want to break down this. And now I want to just break down my sample for you. So these are still sort of the data that you've seen represented here. This one is of aid workers and eyewitnesses, and I think it's really important to include them because their journeys, they're just not telling us what happened, but they're actually, I think, participants. Like they are experiencing this, and I think it's really important for us to understand that some of the moving stories I heard in the Imperial War Museum archive of soldiers who were traveling these routes, who like we had an important mission that they would describe, seeing what they saw. I mean, they are participants. And I think that it's really important to understand the experience of the witness in this. It's not simply just to say, prove it happened, but to say they are participating in this project in whatever way they can. So my aid workers here, I think it's important to help us understand where they traveled and which sites they served at a particular moment. Again, to see if refugees are following aid or if aid is following the refugees. After 1917, the effects of rising prices and famine taking hold in the Ottoman Empire made the experience of a deportee even more precarious. But we also know that after 1917, the Allied occupation meant that some regions saw an increase in aid available to survivors. So if you crossed battle line and got into a refugee camp, you would be a lot better off than if you stayed in a village. And I found a number of Arab communities that actually were able to use aid from these refugee camps as well. It wasn't just for the genocide survivors. People were using aid from these camps because everything had been obliterated by the war. Mapping the people who supported and saw these places deepens our understanding of the deportee experience based on the material, geopolitical, and spatial factors. As I've been saying, when you were in a particular space mattered, and I think this helps us see that. For me, as a World War I historian, once a Victorianist, now World War I historian, it seems, this is particular interest because I really am trying now to reconstruct Allied humanitarian diplomacy in the final years of the war. What did Allied soldiers, observers, and aid workers see? Did it influence the setting up of refugee camps, orphanages, and aid stations in particular regions? I want to know how humanitarianism worked alongside the war machine to shape the civilian experience during and after the war. And I think those two are joined. The humanitarian and the military are connected. They make very strange bedfellows. So let's talk about women. I wanted to see how digital mapping could help us fill in some of genocide silences. We have a lot of memoirs from women who survived the genocide as children, collected many years later. We do not have much from adult women at the time. This map is an attempt to read adult women's gendered experience of deportation. Again, a very small sample. But I think it shows that women had a singular experience of deportation in the caravans because they did not have male protection and they often traveled with small children. It's why so many of these women don't write about what happened immediately after the genocide is beyond the scope of the study. But the problem raises an important question about the relationship between gender and genocide. The women I've mapped here deployed a range of strategies based on political and social status. Zabala Sayan is a quite high profile, very connected person. And some of this just really had to do with luck. But the experience of adult women in the caravans as political exiles had its own internal logic, where survival came from the ability to take advantage of particular opportunity. Kapatian is one of those stories that I found in the end. Her story hasn't been published, but it's there in French, and it's amazing just to sort of see how she sort of uses what she can to find a way for her and her child to sort of move through it. It's remarkable. And I think that like Yasayan, who is an interesting case here, she is a political exile because of course she was the only woman around in the 200 election was rounded up on April 24th. What she does is kind of interesting. Is she's able to engage the British and the French in different kinds of assistance. She ends up at the British legation in Tehran at one point. And I wondered sort of how she did that and why she did that. And she and her daughter end up in Bulgaria. But because she's connected, she's able to find ways to survive in this world. For single men, I have a few more of them. Look at how far they travel. I think that this map and the previous map show that being a deportee means that you experience places quite differently than you had if you were not a deportee. You will now always be a stranger in your own country. You'll always be on the move. Tastian shows how this works on a micro level by using two men's diaries to trace the refugee experience. Tastian's work also shows that moving through a bounded geography, the deportation route forces you to redefine old spaces in new ways according to human need, from clothing, shelter, safety, right? The city can liberate because it provides a space to fulfill needs, make connections, and avoid detection. It's here that the itinerant existence of a deportee survivor takes shape and makes it possible to imagine oneself as a post-genocide, often urban diaspora. And it's remarkable how far these men are traveling, and they're always on the move, right, despite their high status. This final map of political exiles deported after April 24th further illustrates this claim about spaces of diasporic resettlement. The points on their journey, as you can see here, run off the page. The distances that they traveled while in exile shows how political and personal networks transformed into diasporic spaces for those who could not go home. And again, I'd just like to point out that not everyone goes to America, not everyone goes to Europe, that one high profile survivor who ends up in a city is able to then create communities. And I think it helps us understand why you have these pockets of communities that exist in these spaces where they quote unquote shouldn't be. And that these political exiles are people who have influence and connections. And I think that we should follow them pretty closely. And it shows the sort of way that genocide sort of creates these push factors. So how can we conclude this? What does this all mean? What do all these maps mean? Genocide is the experience of a people, victims, observers, and perpetrators. The maps that I've shown you today offer a macro view of the process of displacement and how it transformed the landscape of the Ottoman Empire. Some witnesses to the caravans and mass murders found ways to justify and forget what they saw. Others tried to help. Still others actively enforced the racialized system of erasure and deportation through participating in conversion efforts. Well, it's the victims who are killed, exiled, or absorbed. Genocide scars the psyche of an entire community because the process of erasure is never complete or total. Signs exist everywhere: unexcavated graves, religious symbols and dwellings, property titles that still bear the names of the disappeared. So, what can mapping teach us about genocide as the experience of a people? Judith Butler has argued that we need modes of representation to apprehend atrocity and senseless death, to make those whom the state wants erased seen. The refusal of refugees to disappear by existing on the margins of society, of a society that does not want them, is an act of resistance that confronts the inequality of a social contract that makes the vulnerable into victims of racism and hate. Mapping is one way to show the extent to which victims remain in a world that no longer acknowledges their right to exist. Caravans were supposed to avoid towns, yet townspeople saw them. Evidence was everywhere, in their fields, on their roads, and sometimes for those escaped in their own neighborhoods. The attempt to save women and children by converting them to Islam and renaming them was another unsuccessful attempt to make them disappear. As the memoirs that I've mined show, survivors do not easily forget who they are, and those around them know too by marking them as second-class citizens. Their physical existence disrupts the social order in ways that victims and perpetrators alike unwittingly participate. Social bonds must be remade and places renamed. Exiles create new diasporas. The story of the crypto-Armenians still living in Turkey today is an instructive one. They exist as other, or as one Turkish writer described her own crypto-Armenian grandmother, different. They carry with them the experience of the people in their habits, appearance, and history, despite conversion and seeming assimilation. They are an uncomfortable reminder that you and I once were we. But that's the thing with genocide, it works. Disappearing an individual is the ultimate act of attempting to erase a people. It's more difficult, however, than it seems. When the expulsion order came in 1930 for all internally displaced Christians remaining in Turkey, it was an act that showed the inability of the state to completely disappear them all. It was an act of desperation that said, we can still see you, and therefore we will banish you. The traces of these banished people remain in the mass graves, destroyed churches, and the people themselves who were absorbed into the villages and communities from which they were supposed to have vanished. Finding the traces of those who resisted by existing is one way to reconcile the past experience of genocide with the living, breathing communities of the present. Questions?
There's lots of questions. I also have lots of questions.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I'm really glad. I was trying to hurry up because I'd rather hear your questions than hear me talk. Yes, Heather.
Yeah, okay, excellent. So this is great. And this is admittedly a self-serving question, so you don't have to answer it. And if you don't
No,
want to,
I'm happy
that's
to.
okay.
I'll give it a try.
Great. So what I love about the visualization of this story and is the ways in which you're pointing to arrivals. And I think so much of the story or this history study of genocide is precisely the story of where we come from, or where we were removed from. And these maps show us that the story is a continuation of the story of also arrivals and migrations in the plural sense for both of those two. And right, so I'm a scholar of memory, and I think for me, I'm interested in, of course, the questions of the migration of memory, but also the memory of migration. And someone who works more contemporaneously, we see in the context of like the Lebanese Civil War, Syrian refugee crisis, the port crisis, all of these contact points where the present is understood through the past, or that the past is somehow enlivened, and vice versa, these kind of contact points. But that's so much because I work in the contemporary. And I'm curious if you have ever like looked within those memoirs and seen actually, are those contact points there? Are these survivors also, of course, they're agents, they're witnesses to what they're seeing as they arrive in these nation states, plural. And so are there ever these contact points of narrative, of understanding the present and the history in the present of wherever they end up by looking to the past, or kind of vice versa? And so have you looked into those memoirs and seen those kinds of connections?
Yeah, you do. I mean, you know, so again, my memoirs are tough, right? Because it's someone who is reaching back into the past and trying to make sense of it. And most of them are trying to make sense of their story. And the ones that end up in America have the traditional America, like my grandmother used to, the greatest country in the world, this is what happened, but the ones who, the internal refugees, they sort of get on with their lives in these ways. Some of them migrate and start new lives, but they're very aware. And I think that you're right, this past and present, they're constantly trying to figure out how to situate themselves. And they want to situate themselves in a present that still acknowledges their past. Now, there's also that generation who doesn't want to speak. So the silences, I think, are also kind of crucial, because those are folks who just want the past to be the past and to situate themselves in a way where the memory is not alive and is not something that can hurt them, right, or hurt their families. So I think that the survivor themselves is creating an act. They're writing these memoirs for an audience. And I think that does really matter. So yeah, there is a constant movement between past and present.
Well, thank you very much for this amazing work. It's wonderful. And I like the fact that it's digital, because then you could keep including and incorporating resources from everywhere. I mean, however much to make this more and more complete. So I wanted to ask one about the language. So the memoirs that you used, at least the ones they all belong to Armenians, and they are written either in English, Armenian, or French.
They're all translations. So the ones I was working with,
Okay.
were there's a couple of Greek survivors, but it's interesting because they cross over. So like a Greek survivor, it often ends up within the one I'm thinking of ends up with with an Armenian and a Syrian family.
Yeah,
So they do they cross over. The languages I used were French and English.
Okay.
So it's and the archives I used were British archives. So people who were speaking of these in the Imperial War Museum. So the place I stopped with this project is being able to actually put in stories from people who had not been writing in English. And I think that if we can truly get some archival work that is tracing it, but it's really painstaking. You find these, you've got to read the memoir, and you've got to plot their point. And then my map maker, who is Israeli or was born in Israel, she knew these places. It was funny because I'd be like, well, do you know this place? She's like, oh, well, that's so, like she had this other knowledge for me. So like, I think it takes more knowledge of these other archives. And what I would love to do is to be able to have someone be able to plot those points, and then you give it to a geographer, and then because that would truly be representational. So my project really is just a first.
Well, you're spearheading a very important project, and hopefully the others will come. I mean, there's a lot of memoirs, as you know, I worked with in Turkish that also contain a lot of information.
And what would be wonderful is to get Turkish eyewitnesses and get Turkish participants and like who were present and those kinds of things to plot where they were, and it's like, because they are moving. The war is affecting everybody. So they're moving too, to figure out where. I mean, if you could layer that map, that would be amazing.
Yes.
Especially to see if they were using aid, how they were using aid, if they were able to access that. So that would be a whole nother layer, because it does affect the entire community.
Yeah.
Bread prices affect everyone who needs to be fed.
Yes.
Right? I mean, anything? Yes.
Oh, I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, thank you, Professor. It was a really interesting presentation, and it's a great project, as everyone else said, so I don't have to say that again. But I just had a question, and maybe I majored in history, and I guess I missed this part. You kept mentioning 1930, the expulsion edict. Can you talk a little more about that?
Well, it was the last, I know very little about it, other than it was an edict that said that any remaining internal refugees, were to be expelled. So you had to become a crypto. you could no longer identify. And
From
you
the eastern
probably
provinces, in other
You
words.
probably know more about this than I do.
Yeah, there is a big change, a shift. Well, this is also Gottfried's realm as well, but there is a shift with the formation of the Turkish Republic in the 1930s. That's when they are specifically, systematically trying to get every minority to become Turkish.
Yes.
To speak Turkish, and then if not, to leave. So that's what they're talking about, the 30s. it's very significant that there's the rise of fascism that happens in Europe and in Turkey too. There is this rise against minorities as such, yes.
And in Istanbul, it's a little different because those communities were protected after peace settlement. So that group is less effective, I think, than, well, they still have to do what they're supposed to do. But there still exists there still exists communities in Istanbul.
Well, what they become is they turn very much inward because they're not able to talk in their language, and they sort of face popular justice or whatever you call it, because if they speak in their own language, they get slapped around or beaten up or whatever. And there's a lot of literature on how parents tell their children not to talk in those languages. So we know there's a lot there, or they're made fun of, right? They're denigrated. Yes.
Yeah, so I think that's an important pivot. Nice endpoint too.
Okay, so I'm gonna try and summarize all of this. Okay, so easy ones. One is, do you have any idea of what the route genocide survivors took that made it to Cuba? Then I'm going to do another geographical, you already pointed at it. This is a question by Alan Whitehorn, who's asking whether or not you have any cases of survivors that end up in Greece, and particularly Corfu. So you've already talked about Greece a little bit, but Cuba and Corfu as endpoints, and then I have more here.
Okay, so I can speak of, I do not know, the Cuba case, I do not know how, but there are these, I mean, how people get out and they move is its own sort of story. And I think it really fits into the immigration history, which is, I think, really important. The Corfu story is interesting because it's so connected with British philanthropy. In fact, one of the industrial work sites, I've written about this in an article in Victorian Studies about Anne Mary Burgess, who is this Quaker who starts this industrial work site in Istanbul to aid Armenians starting in the 1890s, actually. She gets there in the 80s, but in the 90s. And she goes all the way through the war. 1920 comes around and they push her out and she goes to Corfu. And with her, she brings her rug making business and the refugees who will come with her, and she sets up her little place there, and they create a refugee community there, but very much focused, like they very much are clearly exiles, and they leave on a British ship. They're protected in that way. But I think with so many of these diaspora stories, the rescue part of it is something that comes as a result of pressures. I was just so surprised how many people wanted to stay. You know, we often think of refugees as wanting to get out to somewhere better. Well, for them, better is home. You know, most of these people wanted, like, my favorite story is this one woman who's like, they're like, well, the French now run this place. I'm like, I don't care. Let me be a French citizen. Like, just send me home. I'm like, but there's a war going on. Like, I don't care. Just get me on a ship and get me home. And so I think that's really important for those who want to stay.
I was going to say, so to that point, and really coming back to your point about military and humanitarian becoming hand in hand with the Allied occupation, are you going to expand any of this to the formation of the Armenian Legion that fought with the French, that was under the French and British military, and then the occupation of Cilicia, southern Turkey, and then a lot of Armenian refugees went back. I mean, I'm sure you know this, but even like, for example, my great-grandmother was born in Sivas, and then they were deported to Deir or some part of Syria, and then they ended up going back to Aintab and like lived in Aintab under this French occupation that then didn't last. And then like somebody married, and then people were like marrying guys that were legionnaires in that legion, that most of them were in America. They left their village, gone to America, came back to fight under the French, they occupied Cilicia, married some lady who was from their hometown that came out of another refugee thing, and then they get kicked out and went back to America or some other country.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's all these even more cross
iterations. Right. So the refugee experience is incredibly diverse, right? And when you look at the internal situation, what you really see is you see this group of people who really want to stay. And after 1930, they can't stay in any meaningful way, right? But they are willing to cross battle lines to get back to a homeland. where usually their homes are occupied. So this is the thing with the genocide, it's different than previous pogroms, right? It's that you can't really go back because of the concerted policy of resettlement, of Muslim resettlement from the Balkans, right, in these regions. You can't really go back to this thing called home. And for the internal refugees, they keep trying, and they keep trying to use their imperial rivalries between the British and the French to get back to where they want to go. And that's what's really interesting, is that it's a new empire. They don't really care that it's an empire. We often think about the nationalists. Oh, Armenians want a national homeland, the Arabs want a national homeland, but they just want protection. Like, you know, if the British or the French Empire can protect us and let us live in Cilicia, fine. And I think that's a really, because they are using joining the Legion, right? They're using those, and the British and the French hate each other right now. They're allies, but oh my gosh, the rivalry between the two of them is terrible. And Armenians and Arabs are exploiting this, particularly to find a way to really to find a way to get back to where they want to go.
I have a few more. But Godfrey has one too. So I'll start with Keith, and then I will build on this. So Keith Waterfall is joining us from California, where it is warm and sunny. And he says, thank you for this wonderful work. I can see how this could be a great undergraduate teaching tool. It would be fascinating to map these maps onto subsequent refugee movements and diasporas, of course. And what his comment is, it's unclear how much of these quote unquote choices were part of Ottoman military policy and the demographic engineering program. So I think he would like to hear more about that. And then I will add to this myself, and I'm wondering what to do with unfinished stories. You, like, looking at my archive, I have these sort of small little biographies of orphans that, you know, tell the story of where they came from, who their parents were, how they were murdered. And then they end up in an orphanage, say in Aleppo or Diyarbakir or some orphanage. And so there's this incomplete story. How would that fit into your mapping? But then also perhaps let's think through Keith's question of what is part of Ottoman military.
Right, and so restoring, one of the reasons I did this project is that often, like in World War I historiography, it's like the Ottomans are like, oh, those hapless Ottomans, they were just part of this war, they were dragged in by Germany. But if we actually see the Ottoman Empire as a foe that the Allies saw the Ottoman Empire, a serious imperial foe, we restore age. It's not just that the Ottomans sort of happened into these things, right? That the Ottoman Empire itself is making concerted efforts to demographically engineer populations. They're making particular kinds of overtures to the British and the French in different moments. They are using the Germans in this way. So by really thinking about putting the Allies and the Ottomans in the same frame, I think we stop saying, oh, it's the problem of the Allies who didn't do enough. They should have created an Armenian mandate. They should have done, but the Ottoman Empire is resisting and working against what the Allies are doing in this, and they are having, this is a diplomatic and military problem. So absolutely, we have to think about this as an Ottoman project of demographic engineering. All those blue dots on my map, those are not, that's not an Allied map. That's not a map that these refugees don't have particular agency in this. They're being forced into that. But even the forcing, my point is that you're forcing so many people to behave and move on these routes, which are actually much smaller spaces than we would like. And I think we can understand that no matter what kind of contingencies the Ottoman government is working on to get rid of this population, there are these spaces that emerge where survivors can find a place. And they are trying to create in these points of contact. They are constantly present. And so I think by seeing the Ottoman Empire as an agent that is in a war situation, we can see their motivations connected to what these humanitarian aid. I mean, these refugees are crisscrossing battle lines. Like, oh, the Allies set up a battle in Bakuba. We're gonna go. and they would cross them and then they would be welcomed into these camps, but still the Ottoman, the conflicts would continue. Your question about unfinished stories,
Actually,
Do you have
Nora
an answer?
Narcessian, well, I have the answer, of course, as
Yes.
always. No, Nora Narcessian has written about the orphanage in Gümrük. And
Yeah.
now she's planning to work on Kazım Karabekir's young army of orphans.
Yeah.
So she is planning, I mean, she is at least trying to track all the orphans and what happened to them. As well.
Right, and one of the things you could think about is the fragment of the story, actually, it doesn't matter that they don't end up, we know what happens at the end, but that we know that they exist in these spaces at a particular moment, and it helps us, I think, establish a pattern of ages, right? It helps us think about like where people are going, and I think it adds to our data, even though we can't sort of finish the story. So for me, plotting these points is also about showing movement even when they disappear. I'm not satisfied with that answer completely, but
Another thing I wanted to add is to go there personally, of course, would also make a big difference. I did go through all of these routes for 5 summers. Every summer I would take, it's from 2002 to 2007, I did that. And every place I would invite Armenian scholars. So when Richard Hovhannissian came to one of them, he wanted to trace the caravan route. And we traced it literally by car, of course, you know. We can. And I cannot tell you, and then there is this one gorge where people were thrown down, how visiting and seeing these sites, even though they have been silenced, just driving for hours in this sort of caravan route with nothing around, just the river, sort of really gives one a much better sense of experiencing it in real time.
yeah, and your work really illustrates how important
Yeah,
the reading and the memory, I mean, your work is just so important for that. Yeah, and I think I need to think more carefully about the narrative, and I think I need to move outside of my history discipline, take off my history hat, right, and really look at those different methodologies that will help me. I think that might be the way to access some of these stories.
You can have excursions there if you go into the country. I don't know if you'll make it out, but at least you'll try.
So I have a map technical question.
Yes.
So I'm looking at what you're showing us right now, and it's for certain individuals is just a wild zigzagging across, and I admit I just have a hard time sort of making sense of it, because of course this map flattens the time dimension.
Yes.
So I was wondering, of course I know the sample is not very big, but have you plotted this put on a timeline to see sort of from, say, on a month-to-month basis, where are they now? And initially, you have also suggested that this has a direct impact on, after all, the military development of it. Have you tried to sort of plot this together with, say, front lines or major battles or something like that?
I have that data, and it's all mapped out and charted by date. We were unable to get that represented in a way that was meaningful, like those blue dots, right? Like what I wanted to do is I wanted all of those blue dots to have a date on them. And Hillis says, Michelle, I don't know how we do that. But one way you might do that is to go to do it by year and month, because I do have that data. But again, because these are survivor memoirs, sometimes it's a little sketchy, but you could do it by year. So I would love to know, like, I would love to have a map that says, where's everyone in 1917, right? Like after March, right? And that would be a fabulous. So maybe one way to do it is to be selective. Is to rather than plot every, because initially I was like, can we plot every point? And just said, no, this layer isn't going to work. But if we could do a couple of key dates, so you could think, where was everyone on October 31st with the signing of the armistice? Like, right? And what? So I think that I'm glad you brought that up, because the dates are really important, especially when you see how people are using those dates. It is a tough representation.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for this. It's a great teaching tool, and the visual put a lot of made a lot of sense, because we kind of know that some people ended up in Greece, some people in Syria, but to see the magnitude and the concentration and the different routes, and it's just fascinating. I don't have a question, rather a comment about the. I really appreciate you started speaking about how World War I ended in one front but continued in another, and particularly, and we've been discussing, Helen and I, about the usage of the word post-genocide, and then the way when we speak about the Armenian Genocide 1915 to 1917 or 1915 to 1918 and between brackets, and then it stops there. But really, from what you are showing is that the afterlives of the genocide that continues on the bodies of people and the memoirs of people, the movement of people. That instigator of violence continued to destroy but rebuild biographies in a very and agency in a lot of important ways. So the experiential and the human really comes out in a very beautiful way. So I can't wait to read the work.
Yeah, the experience is so important. It's hard to access because we think people as victims or survivors, but that is such a complex, and it goes on, right? Whether you talk about it or not, whether you write a memoir or you don't, and the experience of genocide is not, it doesn't just end with the trial. And the Armenians, we didn't have a trial, we didn't have justice. But I think even if there was a sort of trial and justice, the memory and the experience of that is inscribed on generations. And that, I think, makes a huge, it's just important to remember. And it is, you think about this distances. Can you imagine? The next thing I want to do is, in addition to the dates, is really, once I layer the experiences on there, is to just see how far people travel between points.
Well, I mean, but in addition to that, it's the distance, it's the height. I mean, if you go travel in the east, one thing that comes through is that it's incredibly mountainous.
Yes.
I mean, and you travel with these little roads and these huge mountains. I mean, it is very difficult terrain. So even if it is like 10 miles, it will take them forever to go because it's up and down and all around and very dangerous.
Right. Yeah. And the roads aren't always very aren't clear.
No,
and the memoirs have that wonderful texture to them. What they'd say, like it wasn't just, it took days, and and then to be able to say, okay, it took you 3 days to travel 10 miles, whatever it is. What does that then mean for that? But I think I do need to employ more interdisciplinary tools to really think about these experiences and make meaning from them. I mean, I'm like diplomatic history. And I want to know what was happening on the battlefield. And then you think, well, wait a minute, what's happening on the battlefield actually matters in terms of how people are moving. And the crisscrossing is just incredible. And when camp gets shut down, and they say, okay, we're done funding it, it's not a popular movement anymore. Individuals will say, no, we're not going to send women and children into the desert. I'm going to take them to Yerevan. And you're like, oh no, we know what happens then. But those kinds of stories are really, you see the survivors, but you also see the interaction with the people. And that's important too. Anything else? This has been really fun. I had a little stage fright, I have to admit. I haven't done this for years.
Well, I wanted to tell you about my experience, even going there, and I, of course, belong to the perpetrators, I mean, as a category. But so I went and traveled to my own village that at least my maternal side of the family came from. And what was maternal, three sort of things backwards. And what is fascinating is I went there. They had left the village in 1908 or 1905 to migrate to Istanbul so that they could educate their children. Of course, theirs was not forced. It was, I mean, a choice. So that makes everything different. But then I went back there, 115, 20 years later. And then it was very interesting with mulberry trees. It's a small village. You go all the way up, so you get the sense of how hard it is to get there. And then when they came to Istanbul and settled, and we have like apartments and stuff there, the place they settled in also had mulberry trees. So that there was, I mean, they also, when seeking their home, I mean, obviously it was not their home, but they chose nevertheless a piece of Istanbul that was very similar geographically to where they came from. I think similar stories also with California, people who settled there and who sort of grow apples. Of course, they're never as good as the ones back home, but you do see this simulation, this trying to make a synthesis almost.
When I was writing Spurn as Ashes, it's like, oh my gosh, a Calmer and a fig tree will grow in my backyard. And I swear I planted one. And my kids thought I was nuts. I was like, look, I swear a fig.
And it grew.
But it was a Calmer. And of course, I come from farmers. I'm like, oh no, that's different. But it's the hybrid. You need a special wasp. I'm like, you can take the girl out of Fresno, but you can't take Fresno out of me. I mean, it's like,
I have one more from Ron, who's also on the other end here, Ron Suni. And he says, once you put into the dates of movement, would it be possible to see where things started, how they developed? I found it very difficult to create a sensible chronology of the deportations and killing. Your method would lend itself, it seems, to illustrate that.
So creating a chronology for
where things started and then how they developed.
Yeah, well, because some of the, so I really would like to access some more Greek, and I haven't been able to find many Syrian memoirs because their timeline is different, right? Those northern villages are deported much later, and from the limited stuff that I've seen. And I think they actually, eventually they intersect in the southern lands of, in Mesopotamia, or whatever it becomes at that moment. So they do intersect, but really trying to figure out what those chronologies mean. I think you really could figure out the chronology of the deportation. It could really be a good tool to understand survival, because people who could just hang on a little longer, they found safe spaces. It really does speak to how long the Allied infrastructure lasted. My last camp kind of closes around 1921, the summer of 21 that I found. But we know the humanitarians, the ones you're working, the Germans are still giving money, and Nearest Relief is still working. So you still have money, and you still have. I'm sorry, they're not Germans. You know what I mean? I'm sorry, they become yours by historians. Historians get too tied up with our people, But so there's a lot of money. So then that question of chronology that Ron's asking about is really, I think, an important one to figure out, because I started this project to really ask the question about refugee movement. Why do refugees move the way they move, and how do they move in an analog world, right, where they don't have cell phones, they don't have these, how does the information travel, and how do certain groups, why do certain villages survive? Sometimes it's accident, right? Sometimes it's a good, somebody was kind to them sometimes, but often you can figure out which groups survive based on particular kinds of strategies they're using as best they can, which restores that question of agency. So I think that's crucial. You have to figure out the timeline.
It seems to me that what, just by you just talking, what comes out is, and you started with this, of course, with this notion that the more we plot, the more questions we can ask and begin to ask. So your questions are, of course, surrounded by ideas of humanitarianism, because that's what you do, right? But then someone like Ron coming and saying, but what is the chronology of deportations, right? And so there's all of these new possibilities that these patterns perhaps can lend us a sort of vision of. And then, of course, one also has to figure out, coming back to what Helen and Hakim are getting at, sort of the qualitative element. How do you map the qualitative experience, the story? Where I think there's lots of room to grow and do amazing things.
I would see this as an archive versus my own research project that I'm gonna, like, how would I publish this maps, right? Like, I mean, they're hard, you can link them, but it would be wonderful to have enough stories where people could come at them from their disciplinary, corners and say, oh, well, you know what, this actually speaks to me as, and also to ask questions of it, like, can we add another layer that has dates? Well, all right, let's try to, but those are some massive projects. I know NEH has big digital humanities projects, but they really do take someone with a lot of imagination and time. Graduate students who are willing to do it. Stanford did this wonderful project with the partition of Pakistan partition project. I had a student use it. It's brilliant because it's just, it chronicles stories and it shows movement. And it was really an inspiration for this because I had an undergraduate who was like, I want to understand the Pakistan partition. And she was able to ask all sorts of questions. It was her archive. So this could be an archive that was accessible and it had enough stories in it to matter. But I do think we historians need to ask different kinds of questions, and these tools can, the tool is no good if it doesn't allow us to ask other kinds of questions. It's just a fancy thing to put up and say, oh, look at my dots, but it has to make you ask different questions.
One thing you can do, I mean, I immediately when I saw it, I said, oh my God, well, unfortunately, you can't do anything in Turkey at the moment, but in Europe, Berlin, I mean, they do have lots of projects going on there, and also, of course, in Paris with the Novar Pasha Library. I mean, what you could do is maybe apply for a European Union grant. Yeah, and then, and also do it jointly with the Institute for the Humanities, NEH here. And that way, you're absolutely right. This is a transnational project.
And it's tough because it's also, and quite frankly, the way our promotion systems work, the idea of sharing work and sharing the stuff is very, I don't think I could have done this as an assistant or associate professor because I just would not have been given the credit for the kind of work. But right now I'm able to just sort of, just kind of see where this is going to lead. But I also now see the potential of it. And I would really love to just do something. I just would just love to take them. I love to read people's mail, which is why I became a historian. So I'm reading it, like you're just reading them, and it's so much more interesting than some of the diplomatic stuff. But then when you pair that with, gosh, these people are responding to things that people are making, decisions people are making in Istanbul or in London, and they're just trying to make lives out of this stuff, and that is powerful. The other problem with this project, of course, is the trusting the archive. Like, can you trust these survivor accounts? And that's something, it's just a leap of faith. You have to say, I have enough data, I have enough patterns that this does allow us. That's why I emphasize the questions. Like, it helps us ask new questions versus I'm definitively saying this data shows.
But that's the beauty of qualitative work is that you do not need to be quantitatively representative. I mean, those are the meanings that you can all gather together using sort of new tools. And of course, what you're doing is this knowledge experience tension, as you know, that exists in feminist theory. I mean, they're the ones who theoretically first emphasize the significance of experience as opposed to knowledge. So that's also very important.
The first iteration of this, the article, the GMH article, went to a journal that didn't like my stories. They're like, well, how can we trust these stories? I'm like, well, this journal doesn't get it. And then, my readers, my other readers, like, it's amazing we can even access these voices. So you have to come at this with the right sort of spirit, in the sense of, we have to trust the data from the archives that we know and trust, right? And then when we the layering, this is a layer that helps us then think about our archives differently and distinctively, critically.
Yeah.
And then that allows us, that's the method bit of it that excites me the most, is that it's like, I had no idea, like, how were these people present? Like, how were you seeing all these people for that many years? They're just present. And then the expulsion order made sense.
Yeah.
You can't see them anymore, right? I mean, and that was an explanatory tool in that sense for me. So yeah.
one more and then we're gonna have to run out. Like, go ahead, Hakan, yeah.
No, but about the point, how can we trust? I mean, you already at the beginning, you set the tone by saying that it is the memoirs are not about what happened, rather than people making sense and meaning about what happened. That is
I'm gonna emphasize that more because it's about making meaning.
making
Right.
meaning, and
Yeah,
the
I love
majority
that.
of the evidence for quote unquote evidence for genocide has been destroyed. So it is the genocide is in the realm of the unverifiable anyway. That's it. But about the connection to Pakistan, since I'm a fellow I'm obsessed with Lausanne myself. Lausanne was used as, I'm not sure if you trace that, but I'm still trying to trace it, but Lausanne was used as a model for the partition of Palestine and the partition of India. So Lausanne was used as this model to solve wars and diplomacy through basically legal ethnic cleansing.
Well, and then we don't talk about the Irish Civil War that's happening at the same time, 1921. That's a partition story.
Yes.
And so I think we get caught up in the national stuff where we're going to partition, put nations together. But we also have to remember World War I is a war of empires. And the empires do not believe they are fading. They believe it, right? They think that nation and empire are going to coexist in this way. And partition is one way to sort of, it just sort of parse that difficult space between them. But I didn't know about Pakistan as a model, but that makes sense. Yeah, and they don't even walk the line. The British don't even walk the line that eventually is the partition. They say, we don't want to be biased, so they draw it on the map. You know, I mean, that's the story here, but it does make sense because Lausanne is, and Curzon is, you mentioned like he's like Curzon. I mean, he gets so frustrated. He just is like, I'm done. And he lets his minor officials sign the treaty. I mean, it's crazy. I'm going home, and he gets in his cab and he gets on the Orient Express and goes back to London, and everyone's like, and you know, so
Well, at the first round.
the first draft,
That's
and then he never comes back.
Oh, yeah, that's, I
He
know.
doesn't
I
come
know.
back. So that idea is that this is our model, you know, that, you know.
But he does that. I mean, I have an article on Lausanne. I don't know if you know it, but it was I looked at the Turkish memoirs to see how they covered Lausanne. Yes, it's on my CV. I mean,
Okay,
you'll
no,
find
I'm
it
gonna
there.
look for it.
But what's very interesting is that Curzon also said it was like playing poker, knowing what was in the hands of all of the people, because they controlled all the communication through telegram. And then the Turkish, of course, delegation kept sending progress reports, and they all got those reports. The British did.
I want to look at your piece. No, Lausanne is so important. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.